Hey folks, today I want to take a few minutes to look at a question that many people ask about prophetic words. And the question is this: how do I know the word that I have heard is from God? How do I know this is from God? How do I know it's not just my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own perceptions? How do I know it's from God? Well, over the years, there's a few things that I have learned as I've tried to journey this and figure this out for myself. So I want to share them with you, and I hope that they will be helpful for you. So the first thing I would say is this: we can only truly know if a word was from God after it has been given. So no matter how convinced I am that God is speaking, I still won't know for certain until I bring the word. I just won't know. You just can't be certain. And what it means is that every time you bring a word, there is always an element of risk because you can't be certain beforehand. So there's always this element of risk, of taking a risk. And do you know what? That is completely okay. Because guess what? It's faith. The Bible tells us we live by faith, not by sight, not by understanding. We live by faith. And Paul also tells us in the book of Corinthians that we see in part, so we prophesy in part. So the reality is that we only see in part and we only know in part. We cannot be certain. No matter how convinced we feel, no matter how much experience we have in hearing God's voice, whether this is something you've been doing for many, many years, the reality is that you can never be 100% certain if a word is from God until you share it. Until you share it. And so there's always this element of risk. And the reality is that if you want to grow in the prophetic, if you want to grow in hearing God's voice, you must be a person who's willing to risk. Growth, greater growth means greater risk. That's kind of how it works. And I've said this before, but my personal process around this is that if a word is not directional or not correctional in nature, I will always bring it. Because here's the thing: worst case scenario, it's not prophetic, but it's still encouraging. It's not prophetic, it's still encouraging. So here's my kind of recommendation to you. As long as the word you feel God has given you is not direction or not correction, always bring it. So if you're not telling someone, I feel like the next season is this and you should make this decision or that decision, or you're not sort of rebuking someone for how they've handled the thing, or you're not calling out something in their lives, which there's very clear parameters around that stuff as well, which we can maybe look at another time. But if it's neither of those two things, it's neither directional or correctional, I would encourage you, always bring it, because you just cannot know if it's God or not until you share it. Another important thing kind of that goes alongside this is to be wise in your use of language. Do not use phrases like God said, God told me, this is the word of the Lord, anything like that. Because what happens is it gives you no space to be wrong. When you say those things, it gives you no space to be wrong. It's much better to say something like this: I'm learning to hear God's voice, and I feel that God could possibly be saying this. And then once you've said what you've said, you ask for feedback. And feedback is a really crucial element in growing your prophetic gift. So if you ever bring a word that is totally incorrect, you've completely missed the mark on every level, or even if there's you bring a word and some parts land but some others don't and they're incorrect, it's important that we ask the Holy Spirit, why did I get that wrong? What happened to miss that part? How come I was so far off the mark? Holy Spirit, help me understand why, because I want to grow and I want to get better at this. I am learning this, and an important part of any learning process is feedback, and is figuring out why. So the reason often that we may get a word wrong, that it's incorrect, is that we have probably added something to the part of the word that God was speaking. We add our own interpretation to the word, or we have maybe a certain preconceived idea about the person themselves or what's going on in their world, particularly if you know them and you're familiar with them. These are some of the things as to why we can go off track. Quite often, there's three parts, and I know I've shared this before. There's the revelation part, there is the interpretation part, and then there's the application part. And sometimes God might only give us the revelation. And if he does that, then we need to stop there. Because often where we start to get things wrong is we start to interpret ourselves or apply it ourselves. And that's often where we make the mistake. So those are the sort of things that often, send us off track a little bit. But what I want to encourage you, do not let that put you off, because the only way to grow and fine tune your prophetic gift is to get it wrong. It's part of the learning process. Chris Philotton, I was listening to something recently, and he had this great line. He said, in the Old Testament, prophecy is received, but in the New Testament, the New Covenant, prophecy is perceived, where it's not direct from God, but it's something that's it's something that comes to us, and we have to then perceive it. And it's usually in our perception of things where the mistake comes. So here's the thing. When it comes to any prophetic word, the truth is that we will only know if it was truly from God after we have brought it. That's it. We will only know after we have brought the word if it was from God or not. But in saying all of that, there are some principles and practices that we can apply to help us recognize God's voice and to become more familiar with the ways in which he personally speaks to us. So the first principle then is time. As time passes, you become increasingly familiar with the way God speaks to you. They say that it takes 10,000 hours to become proficient at any skill. And the prophetic is no different. The prophetic is no different. The more you do it, the more proficient you become at it. So the first principle is time. The second principle then is friendship. When you are in close friendship with someone, you know their voice. So as you grow in friendship with God, you will become much more familiar with his voice. The third principle then is intimacy. So intimacy, it goes beyond friendship and it grows over time. So intimacy, it goes beyond friendship and grows over time. So I just want you to think, if you're married, think about receiving a phone call from your spouse. Whenever you first started going out, first started dating, you might not have been all that familiar with their voice. But as time passes and the relationship grows, you now know straight away who it is. But more than that, a lot of the time, you will also know why they are calling you as well. And it's that last part I kind of want to lean into a little bit when it comes to intimacy. As you grow in intimacy, you not only become familiar with their voice, but you become familiar with their heart. So as you grow in intimacy, you become familiar with their voice, but you also become familiar with their heart. At the beginning of marriage, a lot of expectations and desires need to be verbalized. But after 5 years, you know the expectations, you know the desires of your spouse's heart, or at least you should. And if you don't, that's probably why things are often a bit turbulent or a bit tense, is because you haven't learned to recognize their desires and their expectations. You haven't got to know their heart. So after a prolonged period of time, these desires, these expectations no longer need to be verbalized. They are just known. And it's the same with the prophetic. As we grow in our intimacy with God, we become familiar with his voice, but we also become familiar with his heart. And that's a massive thing. It's a massive thing to know that the heart of God, the heart of the Father, it's one thing to hear his voice, but it's another thing to know his heart. And when you know his heart, quite often your words will never be far away. And I would even suggest that that's a good filter for you to apply to any prophetic word you feel that the Lord may be speaking to you. Does it sound like his voice? Does it feel like his heart? Does this sound like something God would say? Does this feel like something that's in his heart? And do you know what? If it doesn't sound like his voice and it doesn't feel like his heart, it's not prophetic. And you probably be best to not speak those things. Or if you think, this does sound like his voice, but I'm not sure about his heart. Maybe I'm looking at this person through a bit of my preconceived ideas about them. So what in that moment, what you need to go is, God, I feel like this is a word from you, but is there something that would you show me your heart for them? And then often something else will come. So that's a great sort of filter that you can apply for any prophetic word you feel like you have. Does this sound like the Lord's voice, and does it feel like his heart? So that's a great thing. And finally, as well as these principles, there are also some like practices that you can apply as well. So the first one is this: feedback. Always ask for feedback, and always ask for specifics. Which parts were really right, which parts landed with you, which parts really resonated with your spirit, which parts were a little right. Like there's truth there, but I'm not sure, it just didn't fully have that real like weighty like landing. And then which parts weren't right, which parts were completely wrong, that weren't even close. Whenever you say, you give a word of knowledge and you say, is your name James? And they go, no, my name's William. I don't know a James. You're like, well, sorry, got that wrong. We don't try to, do some kind of prophetic, interpretation that says, oh, maybe in such and such, maybe you're like the Bible character James, and he ties on with it. You're just wrong. And that's okay. We've said it's okay to be wrong. So feedback, ask for feedback, ask for specifics. Second thing then, journal. Write down the feedback that people give you, both the positive parts and the negative parts. And just when we're on journaling, also journal your words that you get as God's speaking. It's good even as in your own devotions, as you're reading the Bible, as you're making notes, and you're hearing God's voice for yourself. I often find, I write things in my Bible quite a lot. And I could be somewhere, and my Bible is usually not far away from me. And do you know what? I'll go, I know I've written something about this, that I feel like the Lord's saying something, but I can't quite fully get it. Do you know what? I'll go to that part of my Bible and I'll find a wee phrase, or I'll find something, and inside that phrase kind of unlocks a whole thought where I know God said that to me, and that's what he wants to say to this person. So journal, write down what you feel God's saying, but also write down feedback. Was the word that I brought right? Was it not right? Or actually it's only time's gonna tell if it's right. And then it's good to also reflect, years back, where you can see that in the moment it was a word that you got that was maybe a bit directional or a bit like, future focused, where you're like, I sense this is the future, but you can't tell in the moment if it's true or not. And then down the line you can go, wow, that word came true. I was right about that. And that just breeds confidence and helps you recognize and gives you clarity about how God speaks to you. Third thing then, humility. Have a teachable spirit. This is so important. Never become an expert. Stay committed to growing. Never become an expert. The moment you become an expert, you're done. No one's an expert. None of us are experts. No matter how long you've been journeying with Jesus, no matter how familiar you are with his voice, you are not an expert. There's always more for you to learn, more for you to grow in. So have humility, have a teachable spirit. Fourth thing then, read. Be someone who reads books, who listens to teaching podcasts by people who are further down the road on their prophetic journey than you. The thing about revelation is, it's taught as well as caught, or it's caught as well as taught. So it's really important to read. It's important to listen. If there are people in your local area, if you hear of someone coming in to speak at an event and they're prophetic, get along to that, get around them, get them to pray for you. Revelation is caught and taught, and it's really important that we are always, as I say, having humility, having a teachable spirit. We want hungry to grow. So get around people who are more seasoned than you, further on in the journey than you. Listen to their teaching and have your thinking stretched, and some of the ways you look at things stretched. Fifth thing, stewardship. be faithful to small words. You know, when we're faithful with small things, God will trust us with big things. It's important that we don't start out in this journey, or even when we're early in the journey and we want the magical word that unlocks everything. You know, because if we wait for that, we'll never get it. Whereas if you feel something small for someone that you just want to encourage them with, or something like that, you know what, when you keep sharing small words that make a difference in people's lives, then you'll start to find God gives you greater revelation, and you get to speak into bigger things, and bigger context, and people with greater influence and stuff like that. So stewardship is massive in the kingdom, and massive in the prophetic. The final thing then, we've talked about it already, risk. You got to be intentional about taking risks. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. Be someone who takes risks. So to kind of pull all this in, we can never fully know that a word is from God until we've brought it. That's just fact. You cannot fully know if it's from God until you share it. But these practices and these principles will help you in the discernment process. They will help you begin to recognize, begin to ask questions and discern, you know, is this from God? Is it not? And as you embrace and implement these principles, these practices, you will begin to grow in confidence and clarity that the Lord is speaking to you. And you'll also gain confidence and clarity, not just of what He is saying, but when you are to share it. Because there's sometimes God speaks. It could be a word for right in this moment. It could be a word for later. It could be a word for a different context. It's really important. You know, to embrace and implement these kind of principles and these practices, because they will really help you grow in confidence and grow in clarity of when the Lord is speaking to you, what He is saying, and when you are to share it. So I hope that has helped you. And you know, if you've got any comments you want to make about that, by all means share them below. Tell us some of your stories. Maybe what are some of the principles or practices that you have that help you in this journey? Because here, I'm not an expert in this. I want to grow, and there's other people watching this who maybe have questions but won't reach out and ask. So if you want to share some of your processes, some of your principles, that would be brilliant as well. So here, I'm going to go. Have a great week, and I'll be back to speak to you soon. God bless.